this example is to actually try and just indicate that it is very important for all of us to know where a constraint lies. Probably the best way to identify a constraint that is limiting an organization to make more money, I learned from Mr. Ravi Gilani, and I present you his stepwise approach to understanding what your true constraint of the organization is. Let's begin at the top. A company has a market constraint if its market share is very high. For example, greater than 50%. That means most of the demand is satisfied by it. Very few companies in the world show a trend of market share of more than 50%. But even if you have a share of market of 50%, even these companies show upward growth. People like Intel, who have a big market share, what do? Their approach to marketing is different. Constantly keep pushing the technology. Keep coming out with the latest. And that latest means an improvement on the past. Very few companies can show this kind of a market share. So, if you don't have a share of 50% plus, you actually don't have a market constraint. There is enough demand in the market. If there is enough demand in the market, but you don't have orders, it does not mean demand is a constraint. It means an order is a constraint. There is enough demand in the market, the company is capable of making the product, but there are no orders. This means you have an orders constraint, not a demand constraint. Next level. How do you check whether it is actually an orders constraint? Do you deliver more than 95% of your order on time? If you do not deliver 95% of your orders on time, you do have an orders constraint. Naturally. If you're not delivering on time, the chances are the customers will not give you orders. But if you deliver 95% on time, it could be that you are not manufacturing on time, which is one and the same thing, right? If you are not delivering on time, the reason could be that you have a operations constraint. What is this causing an operations constraint? Is it that the supplier is not supplying the raw material on time? Let's check if you have a supplier's constraint. You can have a supplier's constraint if you are paying your suppliers on time and you are consuming more than 50% of all the available raw material. Or in other words, the requirement of a raw material is so huge, the suppliers don't have a capacity to supply. So you're paying your suppliers on time, but they don't have the capacity to supply the raw material. All the suppliers put together, anywhere in the world. But if you are not consuming more than 50% of the world raw material and you are paying your suppliers on time, however, it can happen that you have operational policy constraints. There is enough demand in the market, there are orders available to you, and the suppliers are ready to supply. If the three conditions are present, you can have operational policy constraint if you are not able to meet on time in full demand. Let's check if you have operational policy issues. If you are getting raw material on time and your on time in full is less than 90%, and no equipment in the factory is utilized for more than 90% of its available capacity based on a calculation of 24 into 365, then you have a operational policy constraint. In other words, no equipment should have an OEE of greater than 90%. So you have the material available, you have the equipment available, and you are not delivering on time. If these three conditions exist, you have an operational policy constraint. However, if you don't have an operational policy constraint, there could be another form of constraint, which is a capacity constraint. That means you have the raw material available to you, you have the equipment available to you. However, the utilization of at least one of the equipment on a 24 into 365 basis is greater than 90%. The suppliers are ready to supply. There is an order book that you have booked, and now you just don't have the capacity available to deliver it, and this is showing in on time in full. So if on time in full is less than 90% and the OEE, overall equipment effectiveness, of at least one of the resource is greater than 90%, you have a capacity issue. This is called a capacity constraint. This will again impact on time in full. Any addition in capacity should actually translate into increasing in profit. However, there could be another problem with you. This is not a conventional issue, but this is called a balance line problem. That means the constraint keeps shifting. You're trying to balance the demand with capacity, and the constraint keeps shifting. Sometimes demand, sometimes capacity, sometimes demand, sometimes capacity. Again, this kind of a behavior is going to impact. So if your profit is fluctuating, it is not showing an upward trend, it's quite likely that you are faced with a balanced capacity issue. The easiest way to assure a trend or reduction in variability of output is to unbalance the line. The balance line is a situation where there is a shifting of constraint from one to second. That means what you see is an on time in full of greater than 95% and also an overall equipment effectiveness of greater than 90%. If on time in full was constantly coming down, naturally the OEE is not going to be of much use. However, if one doesn't have the above mentioned operational policy, demand, capacity constraint, there's another constraint that could be limiting you from making more money, and that is a cash constraint. Cash shortage does not mean cash constraint. They're two different things. So how do we know that we have a cash constraint? Let us check how do we find out whether we have a cash constraint. You have not been paying your suppliers on time. That means more than 90% of your suppliers have not been paid on time. Second condition, the suppliers are ready to supply you, but they want money upfront. If you're not paying your suppliers on time, it could mean cash shortage but not constraint. So you are not paying your suppliers on time, and now the suppliers are ready to supply to you, but they need money upfront. The third condition, you do not get the supply of material on time most of the time. That means the supplier is supplying on time in less than 90% of its deliveries. So if the deliveries are not on time, or if the supplies are not on time, and the supplier only wants to supply if it gets his payment upfront, and you have not been paying your suppliers on time, these three conditions put together create a situation which is called a cash constraint situation. This cash constraint situation has to be handled in a different way than the others. What I put in front of you is probably the best step-by-step description of identifying the constraint of an organization as I learned from Mr. Ravi Gilani. In sum, an organization can have a market constraint, can have a production constraint, can have a supplier constraint, can have a cash constraint, and can have a policy constraint. All these constraints are defined as constraints only if they are limiting the ability of the company to make more money. And in all likelihood, they will be limiting the ability of the company to make more money. Your ability to identify which constraint is stopping you will also define your approach to getting rid of the constraint. It's quite unlikely for you to have a consistent growth in profit and making money if you have a cash constraint. And it's quite unlikely for you to keep making more money consistently and ROI going up year on year if you have a physical constraint in play. If we know what is the constraint driving us, we also know to what level of performance can we as a company go to, where the highest level being that my net profit increases year on year, also my ROI increases year on year. If any one of the constraints is in play, we will not be at this level. However, it is quite important for you to have a place which is limiting the output, otherwise you would have made windfall profit. This bottleneck, which doesn't limit you from making more money, only controls the rate at which you are making money, and you are managing this bottleneck, you will know at which level of performance you are working. Depending on the bottleneck, your company performance will happen. If your profit is fluctuating year on year, if your profit is growing but ROI is not growing, both these situations are not good enough, and you can go to a place where your ROI also keeps increasing year on year. This can only happen if you have learned how to manage your constraints. How we manage various constraints? It's a matter of a policy and a strategy. In manufacturing management, we actually concentrate on understanding the capacity, constraint, and use of the capacity that we have installed. What kind of policies are going to stop us from making more money?